On June 8, 1302, a group of Florentine exiles belonging to two opposite political parties, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, meet in the Abbey of San Gaudenzio in Tuscany, Italy, to plot a return to the city of Florence that had expelled them. Dante Alighieri, the author of the Divine Comedy, is among them.
Costruita alla fine del Novecento, quindi del X secolo, no? E è importante per Dante perché nel 1302, quando Dante era già in esilio, quindi era stato già estromesso da Firenze, e lui partecipò qui in questa abbazia a un incontro con i fiorentini e anche i Guelfi di parte bianca. Lui era Dante, era dei Guelfi di parte bianca, no? Per venire ad un accordo per poter eventualmente rientrare a Firenze.
20 kilometers from Florence, the abbey is virtually unchanged from the time of Dante. The conspirators may have met in front of this very altar. What did they discuss? Were they successful in their return to their city? Why was Dante among them, a man who had already established himself as an able poet, an astute politician, and an influential citizen of Florence? This is his story, one of the greatest stories ever told, a story of intrigue, mystery, loss, and recovery, but above all, a love story for a woman, a city, and an ideal of universal peace. Though the record of the conspirators' various plots is missing, what we have left is Dante's scathing assessment of the exiles with whom he threw his hopes of returning home. 2 years after the meeting, and after hearing the news of various failed battles, Dante called this group of conspirators wicked and senseless. This is 1304. His story of exile and suffering begins in 1302, when, on a mission of peace to Rome to see Pope Boniface VIII, Dante hears that he has been accused of corruption in office and expelled from Florence. Hopeless, alone, and broke, disillusioned with the other belligerent exiles, Dante lives the rest of his exiled life, as he says, a party of one. Many a writer before and since Dante was exiled, but no writer before or since Dante used the conditions of his exile to create a work of art unparalleled in the history of Western civilization, the Divine Comedy. An epic poem consisting of 3 books, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. The Commedia, which is its original title, describes a journey of a Christian through hell, purgatory, and heaven. 14,233 lines long, the poem was renamed the Divine Comedy in a Venetian edition of 1555 as a result of an ever-increasing public admiration for the poem's sublime excellence. To understand what the condemnation of exile meant in the Middle Ages, we must turn to the complicated politics of Dante's time, the political enmity between the two ruling powers, the empire and the papacy. This struggle for secular and spiritual power dominated the personal and public life of every citizen. The Ghibellines supported the emperor. The Guelphs supported the pope. The names Guelphs and Ghibellines are German in origin.
L'origine dei partiti Guelfi e Ghibellini è legata a una situazione che si è creata in Germania, ma già un secolo prima, ai tempi di una successione per il Sacro Romano Impero. Il nome Waiblingen è il nome di un feudo, di un castello degli Svevi, della famiglia Hohenstaufen, che è la famiglia che prevale, Federico I Barbarossa e poi Federico II, e dal nome Waiblingen tedesco viene il nome dei ghibellini italiani, mentre Guelfi viene da Welfen, cioè il casato bavarese e sassono, insomma, che era rivale degli Svevi e casato che era appoggiato dal Papa.
The fight between the two feudal families in Germany turns into the local politics of Italy and of Florence in particular, and a bloody fight it was. The medieval chronicler Giovanni Villani, Dante's contemporary, tells us the hostilities between the Guelphs and Ghibellines in Florence began as a love triangle in 1215. A young man from the powerful Guelph family of the Buondelmonti, by the name of Buondelmonte, had agreed to marry a young girl from the Amedei, a Ghibelline family, to appease its members with whom he had had a previous brawl. Buondelmonte, however, changed his mind and married a girl from the Donati family instead. This was perceived as a double insult, for which the Amedei ambushed Buondelmonte on the day of his wedding procession and killed him. The incident occurred at the foot of Florence's famous bridge, Ponte Vecchio, beneath the now lost statue of Mars. The event is noteworthy not only because it marks the beginning of the bloody fights between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, but also because Dante mentions it in his poem, Canto 16 of Paradiso. But Florence, in her final piece, was fated to offer up unto that mutilated stone guardian upon her bridge a victim. The death of Buondelmonte destabilized the entire city of Florence. Fighting broke out between the Guelph families, siding with the Buondelmonti, and the Ghibelline families, led by the Uberti. These fights left many dead and entire sections of Florence burned to the ground. The winning side confiscated the losing side's property and destroyed their outward symbols of power, embodied in the many towers the powerful built in their names. Today, some of these architectural selfies can still be seen in the city of San Gimignano, 50 kilometers from Florence, testaments to vanity and wealth. In Florence, where the Loggia del Bigallo now stands, the tower of the Watcher of the Dead rose as high as 195 feet in the air. In 1248, the winning Ghibellines, led by the Uberti family, had every intention of leveling the Guelph Church of San Giovanni, the now famous baptistry in Florence. Villani tells us that the Ghibellines planned to level it by using the Tower of the Watcher of the Dead. The task was given to Nicola Pisano, the inventor of this method of demolition. Pisano deliberately miscalculated the math so that the baptistry was saved. For the populace, this was a sign of divine intervention. Another such sign was the death of the Emperor Frederick II in 1250, fierce opponent of the papacy, whose support emboldened the Ghibellines' vicious retaliation against the Guelphs' property. His death marked the end of the fighting, and a reconciliation took place between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines on January 7th of 1250. The peace, however, did not last long. The events and players in this struggle become the central subject matter of Dante's Divine Comedy, and comprise a prequel to an understanding of the political misfortunes that led to his exile. In 1251, as a result of a disagreement over war with Pistoia, a group of Ghibellines was expelled from Florence. Then, in 1258, the prominent Uberti family secretly aligned itself with Manfred, illegitimate son of the dead emperor Frederick II, to topple the popular government of Florence. Summoned to appear before the city's magistrates, the Uberti and their allies resisted. A fight in Piazza of the People's Palace, the old name for Piazza della Signoria, ensued. Several Ghibellines were caught and subsequently beheaded. The rest of the Uberti and others fled to Siena, a Ghibelline stronghold. The Guelph retaliation was swift. The Ghibellines' houses and palaces were reduced to rubble. A further move was to adopt a new standard. They changed the old white lily on a red field with a red one on a white field, a symbolic gesture to distinguish themselves from the Ghibellines. The leader of the exiled Ghibellines was Farinata degli Uberti, one of Dante's great figures in the fiery tombs of the heretics, with whom Dante argues about the politics of Florence. In Siena, Farinata, through an ingenious ruse, enlisted military help from Manfred against the Florentines. On September 4th, 1260, the opposing armies met at the foot of Mount Montaperti, which would give this famous battle its name. Farinata's ruse was to persuade the 300 German mercenaries that Manfred sent to him to go fight the Florentines, whose numbers, he told them, were small. Farinata knew that Florence had far greater numbers, that the Germans would meet certain death, and that Manfred's standard would be captured and dragged through the mud. Farinata calculated that such humiliation would force Manfred to commit a far greater force, and he was right. In addition, he had secretly plotted with the Ghibellines, who were part of the Florentine troops, to switch sides at the opportune moment. One of these traitors was Bocca degli Abati, who lies in the deepest part of Dante's hell among the treacherous to country and cause. The Ghibellines win the day. Villani tells us that more than 2,500 soldiers died and over 1,500 were taken prisoner. The famous Carroccio and war bell, the Martinella, symbols of country and cause, were also taken. Shocked by the news of its humiliating loss, the Guelphs in Florence lost no time to escape to Lucca. After the victory at Montaperti, the Ghibellines took control of the entire region. Siena and its allies called for Florence's total destruction, but Farinata, still a loyal son of Florence, opposed the plan. At the Council of Empoli, he said he would defend her even if he had to do it alone. For this one act of noble courage, Dante, though he argues with Farinata, depicts him in hell with the political greatness he deserved, but tinged with the pathos of so misguided a life. The Ghibelline rule, however, lasted only a few years. In 1265, Manfred is overthrown, and Pope Clement IV invites the French to help against the Ghibellines. The French forces, led by Charles of Anjou, meet Manfred's army, consisting of Arab archers, German barons, and Sicilian troops, at Benevento on February 26, 1266. Manfred was determined to make a stand against Charles' claim to the kingdom of Sicily, but he is killed in battle, and the Ghibellines' political fate is sealed. An artistically accomplished but politically shady figure, rumored to have killed his father, his half-brother and nephews, Manfred was hated by the popes of his time as much as his father was, and like him, was excommunicated. When he died, on order of Pope Clement IV, his bones were cast about, for no excommunicate could be buried in consecrated ground. Regardless of Manfred's shady reputation, Dante gives him a reprieve and places him in Purgatory 3 among the late repentant. Admitting to having sinned, Manfred speaks to Dante with courtesy, kingly demeanor, and without rancor toward the church that had cast him out and defeated him. Dante has him pronounce one of Catholicism's central tenets, the doctrine of last-minute contrition. Before dying, Manfred asked God for forgiveness and is given a chance to expiate his sins before being able to enter heaven. Dante is thus silent on the medieval chronicler's darker view of Manfred. The Guelph victory at the Battle of Benevento presages the end of the political influence of the Ghibellines. Still rankling from the many family members killed at Montaperti, the remaining Guelphs in Florence grow bolder and stronger. In this social turmoil and violence, Dante is born and will become himself a victim of the political intrigues between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Born in Florence in May of 1265, he was baptized with the name of Durante, a name he will never use in life. Dante is how he signed every official extant document. According to medieval belief, names could illustrate a correspondence between the person and his destiny. Da in Italian means gives, and Dante is one who gave his intellectual gifts to others. Growing up, Dante himself will look for signs of his special destiny and will construct a biographical history that is sometimes at odds with the historical reality. Though his frequent attempts to lift his less than noble birth and embellish his modest economic and social status, his sense of having been born with special gifts and mission in life was prophetic. Dante's house was in the section of the city called San Pier Maggiore, near one of the few buildings still standing from his time, the Tower of the Castagna. Dante's Florence could not boast of the splendid churches, monuments, and art for which it is famous today. Nevertheless, it was considered a large and powerful city, having nearly 50,000 inhabitants around 1280. By 1333, Florence grew to nearly 100,000 to 120,000 people, in large part because it was a center of commerce and banking, attracting outsiders and contributing to the making of large fortunes and influential families. In one of Dante's famous invectives in the Divine Comedy, Inferno 16, Dante will chastise the lifestyle of these newcomers who indulged in ostentatious living, arrogant behavior, and political intrigues. The newcomers and easy money have engendered outlandish pride and excess in you, O Florence, such that you are now in tears. But this view of his city and his countrymen will be far in the future. His father, Alighieri, was neither political nor rich. His mother, Bella, died when Dante was around 12. He was an only son. His father remarried, had 3 other children, a son and 2 daughters. It appears that Dante's father did not have a good reputation.
Ma dire chi fosse Dante, apparteneva a una famiglia di antica nobiltà molto impoverita. Il padre Alighieri prestava denaro a interesse, quindi sospettato di usura, c'è una tenzone da parte, una tenzone con l'amico Forese Donati, in cui Forese rimprovera la famiglia Alighieri e soprattutto il padre di questi difetti, e Dante in qualche maniera è in difesa e non può dire nulla di sostanziale a difesa del padre. Di fatto il padre è una assenza nella ricostruzione che fa Dante della propria vita.
Dante was born a Guelph. We know that his father was neither rich nor influential, because he escaped the punishment of exile after the Guelphs' terrible defeat at the Battle of Montaperti. Dante himself will not mention his father again after his literary spat with his friend Forese Donati. Of Dante's early education we know very little. Dante may have attended lessons in grammar and theology at the Dominican or Franciscan orders, but when he was growing up, there was no school of rhetoric in Florence where he could have honed his craft or studied classical literature. Books in his time were in manuscript format, and copies were made by hand. These manuscripts were often housed in monasteries, and their circulation was limited. Books were expensive and out of reach for the average citizen. Enjoying a high-level literacy in matters of banking and finance, Florence curiously lacked opportunities for students interested in a classical education. Given its wealth, it is even more surprising that Florence lacked interest in cultivating it. It was a city that had a few individuals educated in the humanities, and these were relied upon for wise counsel, civic transactions, and political negotiations. Schools, such as they existed, were centers of little learning and a great deal of abuse. One of Florence's renowned citizens for his culture and literary accomplishments was Brunetto Latino, who, after returning home from his exile in Paris, practiced his profession as notary. He had achieved fame as the author of the Tesoretto, an encyclopedic work in verse greatly admired in his time. Brunetto Latino's expertise in rhetoric and his central role in Florence's political and civic engagements make him a likely candidate in having guided Dante's early education. In a meeting between Dante and Latino in Inferno 15, Dante calls him his teacher and addresses him with these moving lines. I remember you, and now am moved by your dear, your kind fatherly image, when in the world above, from time to time, you taught me how man makes himself eternal. Considerably older than Dante, and certainly busy with matters of state, Brunetto Latino, as a leading figure in the art of rhetoric, particularly the useful art of letter writing, took Dante under his wing and guided him in his studies. What is known of Dante's early life is that he was immersed in private study and was not engaged in the politics that would eventually be responsible for exiling him. Living off the small inheritance his father left to the family, Dante honed his poetic skills in solitude. He was engaged early when he was a young boy to Gemma Donati of the influential family of the same name. He married her when he was in his early 20s. They had 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. Dante did, however, cultivate a friendship with another famous Florentine, calling him his first friend. Aristocratic and wealthy, a distinguished poet and philosopher, Guido Cavalcante was another important mentor who exposed Dante to literature and philosophy. The friendship with Cavalcante and their poetic exchanges helped Dante enter the exclusive group of rhymers in which Cavalcante figured prominently. This friendship eventually frayed when Dante saw himself surpassing his mentor in poetic skill, going so far as to call him his John the Baptist, a harbinger to the greater poet to come. When Dante becomes one of the priors of Florence from the middle of June to the middle of August of 1300, he agreed to exile several political troublemakers, among whom was his friend. In exile in the Sarzana, Cavalcante contracted malaria and died. But the seminal event of Dante's boyhood is the meeting in 1274 with a young girl by the name of Beatrice, when he was 9 years of age and she was 8. He fell deeply in love. After the meeting, he began to compose sonnets, eventually writing a book dedicated to his friend Guido Cavalcante, called the Vita Nuova, or New Life, a composition consisting of poetry and commentary on the vicissitudes of this love, the development of his poetic theory, and the emotional turmoil he suffered when Beatrice died on June 8th at the tender age of 24. Who was she? Was she a real woman or a legend? We are told that she was Beatrice Portinari, the daughter of Folco Portinari, a powerful and respected citizen of Florence, who invited Dante's family to a May festival at his house in 1274. Dante writes in the Vita Nuova that when he saw Beatrice at this party, he was immediately smitten with her grace and beauty. This famous meeting was subsequently recounted and embellished by Dante's first biographer, Giovanni Boccaccio, in his book called Treatise in Praise of Dante, composed between 1350 and 1355, long after Dante's death in 1321. Boccaccio's dating of the May festival is that of Calendimaggio, a tradition that did not occur in the 1270s, casts some doubt on the details of his narrative. Nevertheless, Dante's emphasis on this event, whether fact or legend based on fact, is one of the few details that we have of his early life. Beatrice's significance in the Vita Nuova and the greater poem to come, the Divine Comedy, is central.
Nella Vita Nuova Dante dice che ha conosciuto Beatrice a 9 anni, quindi quando era bambino. Boccaccio racconta i particolari, naturalmente si tratta di una storia leggendaria, cioè l'avrebbe conosciuta a una festa in casa Portinari, perché Beatrice sarebbe appartenuta appunto a questa famiglia. Naturalmente 9 anni è anche un numero simbolico che è legato alla figura di Beatrice, soprattutto nella Vita Nuova. 9 è un multiplo di 3, che era il numero della Trinità. Quindi noi oggi tendiamo tutti a credere alla realtà della figura di Beatrice. Il dibattito di una volta, i dubbi che c'erano sono stati largamente abbandonati, ma questo non ci obbliga per niente a credere poi ai dettagli di tutta la vicenda o a queste date. Io tenderei sempre a riportare queste cose alla situazione della poesia provenzale, insomma, perché secondo me non c'è ancora una grande differenza fra italiani e provenzali. Cioè le donne dei trovatori, la maggior parte delle volte, erano delle donne reali, appunto realmente conosciute. Dopodiché però i trovatori nelle poesie intessevano delle vicende appunto spesso anche inventate o spesso leggendarie, insomma. Beatrice da subito diventa per Dante simbolo di tante altre cose e ha tutto un suo sviluppo, insomma, nella vita di Dante, vero? Quindi non siamo poi obbligati naturalmente a credere a tutte le singole particolarità.
After the first meeting, Dante did not see Beatrice again until 9 years later, in 1283, when they were both 18 years of age. On this occasion, Beatrice acknowledged his presence with a greeting. This acknowledgement inspired him to write a sonnet entitled "To Every Captive Soul and Gentle Heart," which is the earliest composition that we have of Dante. This lyric marks the beginning of a series of poems that Dante will write under the spell of Beatrice and that will become the book, the Vita Nuova, and he will construct a narrative that is both autobiographical and fictitious in the manner of the amorous tradition of courtly love, which sanctioned love outside of marriage.
Sull'amor cortese esiste una bibliografia sterminata ed esistono anche ipotesi molto diverse che sono state elaborate più nell'ambito della provenzalistica, cioè degli studi sui trovatori, perché da questo punto di vista gli italiani sono dei figli in qualche modo dei trovatori, insomma. L'amor cortese, nella sua versione più normale, è appunto un amore extraconiugale ed è anche un amore platonico, che non ha uno sbocco di tipo sessuale, insomma. Quindi è una relazione di tipo impedito. Naturalmente anche nei trovatori questo non succede sempre, voglio dire, ci sono dei casi in cui le cose stanno differentemente. Essendo una relazione impedita, è una relazione che naturalmente tende a essere spiritualizzata, cioè la donna diventa qualcosa di elevato e di irraggiungibile.
Italian poets inherited the tradition of courtly love from the Provençal troubadours. Professor Sweetner explains how Dante's own poetic practice, called Sweet New Style, which culminated in the Vita Nuova, the book about Dante's love for Beatrice, evolved from this tradition. Because the Church condemned the extraconjugal themes of courtly love, poets responded by spiritualizing woman to the point where love of God and love of woman were the same.
Gli italiani, vero, fin dall'epoca dei provenzali c'è tendenzialmente una dualità fra amore sacro e amor profano, vero? I vescovi, gli ecclesiastici spesso parlano male della poesia cortese. Una delle reazioni dei poeti è la tendenza allora a spiritualizzare l'amor cortese. Allora il dolce stil nuovo degli italiani, che culmina in qualche modo nella Vita Nuova di Dante, può essere stato un tentativo al massimo livello, ovvero di spiritualizzare l'amore profano. Insomma, l'amore profano finisce col mescolarsi con l'amore di Dio.
The Vita Nuova, composed between 1292 and 1293, after the death of Beatrice in 1290, is the first work that shows Dante as a poetic innovator, working in a new literary movement called the Sweet New Style, which rejected the artifice of courtly love poetry. The poet's love, this new poetry declared, came from his heart. Dante's Beatrice is not only a beautiful and desirable woman, even angelic, as the women in this amorous tradition were, but she is also instrumental in his spiritual salvation. Alone among these new poets, Dante casts Beatrice as a figure of theological significance. Another radical idea introduced by the Stilnovisti, the name given to the poets of the Sweet New Style, was a new definition of nobility, which, they argued, did not come from noble birth. It derived from a man's capacity to love. This was a subversive idea at a time when the privileges and the power of the noble class seduced many who could afford it to enter its spheres of influence. Dante will make the sincerity of feelings fundamental to his poetic credo, informing his criticism of the excesses of the rich and powerful, whose entitlements spoke not of true nobility, but of greed, malice, and vindictiveness. This frontal attack on the decadence of his time will make Dante a cultural and political Jeremiah. But with the publication of the Vita Nuova, we are at the beginning of his career, when he is seeking to achieve recognition in Florence among the intellectuals, during a time when talent alone did not suffice for social or political advancement. Prior to the publication of his first book, Dante had succeeded in calling attention to his artistic abilities by exchanging several lyrics with Guido Cavalcante and other poets. The Vita Nuova, however, was going to showcase his innovative talent as a poet. The book includes 31 lyrics written between 1283 and 1292, and 31 paragraphs of prose commentaries added during its composition. It is both a narrative of his love for Beatrice and an engagement with several poetic traditions whose focus is the nature of love. Dante moves from the opening scene of a dream in which he sees Beatrice eating his heart to a final vision of her in heaven among the blessed. Dante's inclusion of the commentaries to his poems was new in the history of Western literature. While Provençal and classical literature have examples of literary works that combine poetry and prose, there was no work before the Vita Nuova in which a poet collected his own poems and provided his own explanation on the meaning of those poems. Dante, coming to his lyrics at a distance of about 10 years after their original composition, organizes and explicates them to show the book's organic unity and his artistic development. The prose, in the view of many critics, is central to understanding the lyrics. Framed by a preface and a conclusion, the Vita Nuova's 3 distinct thematic sections show Dante working within the styles and themes of the new poetic movement, but also striking a new note within the innovations of his contemporaries. Each section of the book is marked by a crisis in the poet's relationship with Beatrice, which leads to a poetic epiphany that changes the poet's tone and direction. The first section recounts the meeting with Beatrice, the reliance on seeing her, and the reception of her greeting. The story of this first acquaintance employs a standard stylistic device of the courtly love tradition, the screen lady, to deflect the true interest of the lover. These poems recall the poetry of Guido Cavalcante, to whom the Vita Nuova is dedicated. Here is where we see Dante positioning Cavalcante as a precursor whose poetry concentrates on the sensual aspects of love, its agonies and frustrations, a kind of sickness. Cavalcante's stress on the physical aspects of love, Dante will ultimately reject. The crisis in the first movement is the withdrawal of Beatrice's greeting, and an incident in which she ridicules Dante publicly for his less than acceptable amorous conduct. This public shaming forces him to reevaluate his relationship with Beatrice. He resolves the crisis by changing his relationship from an exterior one, dependent on seeing the beloved, to an interior one, where the poet finds happiness and fulfillment in praising her for her beauty and gentle nature. The second section of the Vita Nuova shows an adherence to the poetry of Guido Guinizelli, considered the father of the sweet new style. Born around 1225, Guinizelli died in 1274, when Dante was 9. Guinizelli's poetry, however, had a strong influence on the upcoming Tuscan poets, among whom was Dante's friend, Guido Cavalcante. Many of Guinizelli's lyrics also focus on the emotional turmoil that love can cause a lover, the agony of a spurned greeting, the beloved's haughtiness and distance. But a few of these poems introduce a different view of woman. She develops into a spiritual being, an angelic figure. The love for her is then seen as ennobling the lover and raising him to a level of true nobility. The narrative begins with an encounter between Dante and several noble ladies who, having discovered his love for Beatrice, ask why he is then so melancholy. Stung by the reproach, and after a brief internal struggle, he is inspired to write only in praise of Beatrice. The newfound goal is sidetracked by the sudden presence of death. First, Beatrice's father dies, then Dante becomes ill, and then he dreams of Beatrice's death. An earthquake, he tells us, accompanied her death. Birds fell dead from the sky, the sun darkened, and women wail the loss. The comparison to the death of Christ on the cross is unmistakable. The God of love comes to the rescue of Dante's distress and commands him to cheer up and be happy in his love for Beatrice. Occurring at the very center of the collection of poems, the lyric about Beatrice's death, entitled "A Lady, Kind of Heart and Young," is a pivotal one. It divides the description of a real-life Beatrice to one that will become more emblematic of a spiritual and theological reality. Two noteworthy events occur in this section. Dante's resolve to write in the vernacular, the language of the common man, and the sighting of Guido Cavalcante's love, Giovanna, walking in front of Beatrice. Given that the masculine form of Giovanna is John, the event, Dante explains in his commentary, recalls John the Baptist, preceding the coming of Christ, or the true light. The inference here is that Cavalcante himself was a precursor to the greater poet who is Dante. In this section, Beatrice continues to be understood in theological terms. When joy finally comes to Dante, he composes one of the most admired sonnets in the book, entitled "So Gentle and So Full of Dignity She Appears." In the third section of the Vita Nuova, Dante faces the grief over Beatrice's actual death on June 8, 1290, which he had dreamt about in the second section of the book. The religious association between Beatrice and Christ prepared the reader for her transformation from an angelic figure in the manner of Guinizelli to a religious symbol, a transfiguration from the human to the divine, a concept unique to Dante. Before final insight, however, Dante describes his grief over Beatrice's death until a donna gentile, or kind lady, who saw him so distraught, takes pity on him and succeeds in distracting him. This new interest makes him forget Beatrice. However, he manages to reason his way out of this betrayal when he sees Beatrice in heaven with God and understands her ultimate significance. The Vita Nuova concludes with a promise to write of her what has never been written of woman before. This promise of a future work has been interpreted with some reasonable challenges to this interpretation as the Divine Comedy. For a young man of modest means, regardless of his poetic talent, There were few, if any, easy ways to advance socially or politically. He was not, however, totally disengaged from the duties of a citizen of Florence. In times of war, one was expected to do his part, and Dante participated in 2 military events as a knight at the Battle of Campaldino on June 11, 1289, and at the surrender of the castle of Caprona to Florence, as he himself tells us in Inferno 21, comparing his fear of the devils to that of the defeated foot soldiers before their Florentine enemies. I feared that they might not keep their word, like the infantry I saw marching out from Caprona under safe conduct. These experiences left an indelible mark on his dramatic imagination.
Queste esperienze militari saranno state esperienze forti appunto per il giovane Dante, anche se è difficile capire le tracce che possono aver lasciato nella Divina Commedia. Nella Divina Commedia fatti d'arme o fatti cruenti sono descritti con grande realismo, però c'è da osservare che questo tipo di realismo è una caratteristica di Dante sempre e comunque, insomma, di qualunque argomento egli tratti. Alcuni hanno ipotizzato che, ad esempio, in certi episodi infernali, come quello dei seminatori di discordia che sono squarciati da orrende ferite, possano vedersi tracce dirette, insomma, di quello che Dante poteva aver visto sui campi di battaglia.
In the early part of the 13th century, the knights that fought in battle usually came from the higher rungs of society. Fighting in war had strong social and economic incentives. Knights had access to the spoils of war, were compensated for material losses, and ensured a ransom in case of capture. By Dante's time, the benefits of serving in battle as a knight had greatly diminished economically. Having to supply one's own horse and armature was a financial burden and a sacrifice, though it was still advantageous for one's political standing and prestige. After his military service, however, Dante would not enter politics until he was 30 years of age, partly out of personal choice and partly from exclusions dictated by the ordinances of justice instituted in 1292. These laws excluded the nobility and anyone not belonging to the major guilds from participating in the governance of the city. These laws were a reaction to the many fights between opposing political families, usually nobles and magnates, that destabilized the banking and commercial interests of Florence. When the ordinance's chief architect, Giano della Bella, was forced out of Florence in 1295 by the very nobles he tried to control, the city relaxed some of the regulations of the ordinances of justice. These revisions permitted those in the minor guilds to enter politics. It is believed that by 1295, Dante already belonged to the Guild of Physicians and Apothecaries as an inactive member. When the laws changed in favor of the minor guilds, Dante seized the opportunity to enter public office. Although never wealthy, he did have the means for the necessary military expenses incurred in the Battle of Campaldino, or the appropriate clothing to mingle with such aristocrats as Guido Cavalcante. One can gauge Dante's determination for political involvement from the steep debts incurred with his stepbrother Francesco around the same time that he was making his way up the political ladder. In 1296, Dante was a member of the Council of 100, whose membership fee of 600 gold florins comprised most of the 707 gold florins that he borrowed in 1297, a fortune that probably amounted to his entire net worth. He continued to strain the family's finances when he borrowed more money in 1300. This financial gamble, however, paid off handsomely. In just a few years, on the 15th of June 1300, Dante was elected to the highest office as one of the 6 priors for the standard term of 2 months. He was the first of his family to achieve such a high position. By this time, Dante had gained the reputation of a philosopher, a man of wisdom, filling the lacuna left by the death of his teacher, Brunetto Latino, whose use of rhetoric in the interest of the public good was a great loss to the city. Now it was Dante's turn to place his learning in the service of Florence. His role in the various governing bodies is the only record that we have of his life at this time. While in office, Dante was a staunch opponent of Pope Boniface VIII, who interfered in the affairs of the commune, an interference responsible for much of the violence and unrest in Florence. The constant fighting between the powerful families of the Cerchi and Donati precipitated the prior's decision of exiling the leading troublemakers. Among these was Corso Donati, leader of the Blacks, and Dante's friend Guido Cavalcante, who contracted malaria while in exile and died. The meddling of Pope Boniface VIII to undermine the White Guelph party and encourage the takeover of the government of Florence by Charles of Valois necessitated the drastic measure on Florence's part of sending an embassy to Rome in October of 1301 to ask the Pope to stay out of its politics. Dante was the distinguished member of this delegation. The Pope, duplicitous by nature, knew that Charles of Valois was already closing in on Florence. We don't have the minutes of the meeting between Dante and the Pope, but we can surmise that he withheld the information and sent the delegates away with vague promises of non-involvement. In the meantime, with subterfuge and deception, Charles of Valois had entered Florence and taken over the government, thus handing the Black Guelphs and Corso Donati a victory over the Whites. Returning to Florence in a short distance from home, on January 27, 1302, Dante hears that he has been accused of corruption in office, fined, and exiled for 2 years. Bristling at the charge, Dante refused to pay within the 3 days prescribed time. As a result, his property was confiscated and a second sentence followed. On March 10, 1302, he was condemned to death by fire. Despite his lingering hopes of an eventual pardon and return, he would never see his native Florence again. Dante's quick rise to the highest political office in Florence in the span of a few years turned into a living nightmare. When Dante first heard of his exile on January 27, 1302, he was on his way home. He may have stopped in Arezzo, a city 54 miles from Florence. Exile was a familiar political tool to him because he himself had used it to rid the city of Florence of several troublemakers when he was one of the 6 priors. His friend Guido Cavalcanti, who contracted malaria in exile, was one of these and paid a high price for it. Now it was Dante's turn. Some exiles were eventually allowed to return. There was a process in place for amnesty. On May 19, 1315, such an amnesty was declared, but Dante rejected the humiliating conditions under which the exiles would be allowed to return. He had no intention of paying the imposed fine or subjecting himself to oblation. The ritual required that the returning exile enter the baptistry of St. John wearing a penitential sackcloth, tantamount to a public admission of guilt. Conscious of his innocence and driven by a high sense of justice, Dante refused. As a result, his name was deliberately excluded from subsequent offers of amnesty. In legal terms, Dante's condemnation of exile stipulated the expulsion from Florence for a period of 2 years, the payment of a fine, and exclusion from politics, which meant a denial of citizenship and destroyed one's very identity, making an exile a virtual alien in his own country. We can gauge the importance of civic identity when Dante meets Charles Martel in Paradiso 8. A prince of great promise, Charles Martel died young and had shown regard for Dante's poetic talent when he once visited Florence. At their meeting in the afterlife, Dante answers Martel's question on whether it would not be worse if man were not a citizen, with an ambiguous yes, a yes that required no further explanation. Being cast out of his beloved Florence and denied his civic identity must have been a devastating blow for Dante.
I think Dante says exile best when he's talking with his, that's a Dante the poet, when he's talking with his great-great-grandfather Cacciaguida. You know, you're always going to be going up somebody else's steps, and here in Tuscany, it's easy to remember this, how salty is the bread of others. And I think that's right. And of course, that's a universal idea of exile. You're taken away from everything that's familiar. Family, neighborhood, home, friends, job. All those things are gone. And of course, exile is used much more than in modern times as a kind of punishment. We know that in the sort of Guelph Ghibelline struggles that took place, it was much closer to a winner-take-all than it would be in if that were played out in the modern world between Republicans and Democrats or conservatives and labor or whatever it might be. And so, of course, exile was extraordinarily painful because you're literally left out of your homeland. And that's really the nature of it. And of course, Dante's turned out to be for life, although there may have been a time when he would have been able to go back had he wanted to and compromised certain things that he would not compromise. But that notion, I mean, it's hard for us to imagine, I think, in any time, whether it's now or then, of walking away from your hometown and sort of looking back one last time and saying, I'm never going to see this again. I'm going to have to start over.
In the first 2 years of his exile, Dante found himself in an almost surreal situation, collaborating with those considered Florence's enemies. On February of 1302, he joined a group of exiled white Guelphs and Ghibelline lords at the castle of Gargonza. These lords had seen Florence gradually undermine their power and force them into brigandry in their attempt to ward off further encroachments. This unlikely group of comrades that met at the castle of Gargonza fought brief and sometimes successful skirmishes against the Florentines, giving Dante some hope for a re-entry into the city. For 2 years, he was probably the secretary of an organization called the University of the White Guelphs of Florence. Such organizations were common in both parties of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The novelty was that it split the Guelphs into 2 distinct sides, whites and blacks. Dante's job for this new organization was to plan strategy and to conduct diplomatic agreements with the Ghibellines and friendly cities. Such a job provided him with a livelihood. He alone among these members had the education and rhetorical skills to carry on the political business of the association. Florence did not look kindly towards the siding with the Ghibellines and branded the white Guelphs traitors as well as Ghibellines, an even worse accusation. On June 8th of 1302, we know for certain that Dante was at San Godenzo, the mountain town in Tuscany where our story began. San Godenzo to this day celebrates a feast called Dante the Ghibelline. This meeting brought together old enemies who set aside their historical hatred for one another to fight the Black Guelphs in Florence.